Ruth Jackson stepped out of the bus and onto the busy street corner. The sun was bright, casting long shadows across the sidewalk as people hurried past her. She adjusted the strap of her purse on her shoulder and smoothed down her floral print dress. Her wide-brimmed hat shielded her face from the glare, but it didn't hide the determination in her eyes. Today was a special day. She had saved for years, pinching pennies and skipping luxuries, all so she could finally buy herself a car. Not just any car, though. A nice one. Something that would make her feel proud when she drove it down the road. The dealership loomed ahead, its shiny glass windows reflecting the sunlight like a beacon. Rows of gleaming cars sat inside, each one more impressive than the last. Ruth took a deep breath and walked toward the entrance, feeling both excited and nervous. She wasn't used to places like this. Big, fancy showrooms where people wore expensive suits and talked about things like horsepower and financing plans. But she reminded herself why she was here. This was her dream, and no one could take that away from her. As soon as she stepped inside, the air changed. It was cooler here, almost too cold, and everything smelled faintly of leather and polish. Salespeople moved around the showroom, chatting with customers or leaning casually against the hoods of cars. Ruth hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do next. Then, a man approached her. He was tall and thin, with slicked back hair and a toothy smile that seemed a little too eager. "Hi there. Welcome to Premier Motors," he said, extending a hand. "I'm Greg. How can I help you today?" Ruth shook his hand firmly. "Good morning," she replied. "I'm looking to buy a car." Greg's smile widened, but there was something in his expression that made Ruth uneasy. Maybe it was the way his eyes flicked over her outfit, a simple dress and sensible shoes, or how quickly his enthusiasm seemed to fade once he realized she wasn't dressed like most of the other customers. Still, he nodded politely and gestured for her to follow him. "What kind of car are you interested in?" he asked, leading her deeper into the showroom. "Well," Ruth began, glancing at the rows of vehicles, "I've always wanted something comfortable and reliable, something that'll last me a good while. And maybe something a little stylish, too." Greg raised an eyebrow but kept his tone light. "Sure thing. We've got plenty of options. Do you have a price range in mind?" Ruth hesitated. She knew exactly how much money she had saved, down to the last dollar, but she also knew better than to reveal that right away. Instead, she simply said, "Let's start with your mid-range models." They stopped near a sleek sedan, its surface sparkling under the showroom lights. Greg launched into a detailed explanation of its features, using words Ruth barely understood. Horsepower, torque, advanced braking systems. It all sounded impressive, but she couldn't shake the feeling that Greg wasn't really paying attention to her. His eyes kept darting toward the door as if he were waiting for someone more important to walk in. After a few minutes, Ruth interrupted him. "That sounds lovely, but I think I'd like to see some of your higher-end models, just to compare." Greg blinked, caught off guard. "Higher end?" he repeated, his voice tinged with disbelief. "Ma'am, those cars are quite expensive. Are you sure?" "I'm sure," Ruth said firmly. "I'd like to see them." For a split second, Greg looked annoyed, but then his professional mask slipped back into place and he forced another smile. "Of course. Right this way." He led her to a section of the showroom filled with luxury vehicles. Ruth's heart skipped a beat as she gazed at the elegant designs and plush interiors. These were the kinds of cars she'd only ever seen in magazines or on TV. One in particular caught her eye, a silver sedan with smooth curves and a dashboard that looked like it belonged in a spaceship. She ran a finger along its hood, marveling at how flawless it felt. "This is beautiful," she murmured. "How much does it cost?" Greg glanced at the car, then back at Ruth. There was a flicker of impatience in his eyes now. "It starts at $75,000, he said bluntly, "but that's before taxes and fees." Ruth nodded thoughtfully. She hadn't expected it to be cheap, but the number still made her pause. Still, she wasn't ready to give up yet. "Could we sit down and talk numbers?" she asked. "Maybe go over some financing options?" Greg sighed audibly. "Ma'am, with all due respect, these cars aren't exactly within everyone's budget." Do you have pre-approval for a loan? Or proof of funds? Ruth reached into her purse and pulled out an old checkbook. I don't need a loan, she said calmly. I plan to pay cash. For a moment, Greg stared at her, dumbfounded. Then his expression hardened. Cash? Ma'am, I'm sorry, but I don't think you understand how this works. You can't just waltz in here with a checkbook and expect to buy a luxury vehicle. We need verifiable assets, credit checks. I have savings, Ruth interrupted, her voice steady despite the rising tension. Years worth. I came here because I want to buy a car, not because I'm wasting your time. Greg threw up his hands in frustration. Look, I don't mean to be rude, but this isn't going to work. If you don't have proper documentation, I can't help you. Why don't you try one of our competitors? They might have something more suitable for your situation. Ruth felt her cheeks flush with anger and embarrassment. Suitable for her situation? What did that even mean? Before she could respond, Greg turned on his heel and strode away, leaving her standing alone beside the silver sedan. Other customers glanced curiously in her direction, and Ruth suddenly became hyper-aware of how out of place she must look among all these polished faces and designer clothes. A few minutes later, another employee, a younger woman with a clipboard, approached. Excuse me, ma'am, she said gently. Is everything okay? Can I assist you with anything? No, Ruth replied stiffly. I was just leaving. She clutched her purse tightly and headed for the exit, her head held high despite the sting of rejection. As she pushed open the glass doors, she heard Greg laughing with another salesman nearby. Their voices carried through the air, sharp and mocking. Can you believe that? Greg said. She actually thought she could afford one of these cars with a checkbook. What is she, 80? The other man chuckled. Probably doesn't even know how to drive. Ruth froze, her hand gripping the doorframe. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She told herself it didn't matter what they thought of her. She had worked hard her entire life, raising children and caring for others, often putting their needs before her own. She deserved to be treated with dignity, not dismissed like some kind of joke. Still, the hurt lingered as she stepped outside. The bustling city streets offered little comfort. People rushed past her, oblivious to her pain. For a moment, she considered giving up. Maybe Greg was right. Maybe she didn't belong in a place like that. But then, as she stood there trying to collect herself, something unexpected happened. A man appeared beside her, a stranger with kind eyes and a warm smile. He introduced himself as Mr. Carter and said he'd witnessed the whole scene unfold. Without judgment or pity, he offered her a lifeline, an opportunity to turn the tables on those who had wronged her. Ruth stood on the sidewalk outside the car dealership, her heart heavy with humiliation. The bustling city noise seemed distant now, drowned out by the voices in her head replaying Greg's cruel words. She clutched her purse tightly as if it were a lifeline keeping her grounded. Just when she thought she might cry, a calm voice interrupted her thoughts. Excuse me, ma'am. Are you all right? She turned to see a man standing beside her. He was older, probably in his late 60s, with silver hair and a neatly pressed suit. His face was kind, and his eyes carried a warmth that made her feel seen in a way she hadn't inside the dealership. I'm fine, Ruth said quickly, though her tone betrayed her. Just having a bad day. The man nodded slowly as if he understood more than she had said. My name is Mr. Carter, he introduced himself. I couldn't help but notice what happened back there. That salesman didn't treat you very well. Ruth sighed, feeling too tired to argue or deny it. No, he didn't, she admitted softly. But I suppose it doesn't matter much. People like me aren't meant for places like that. Mr. Carter raised an eyebrow. People like you? He repeated gently. And who exactly are people like you? Ruth hesitated, unsure how to explain. Older, not rich. Someone they think can't afford anything nice. Mr. Carter shook his head. That's their mistake, not yours. You deserve respect no matter where you go or what you wear. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. His words struck a chord, deep within Ruth. For years, She had spent her life caring for others, raising children, working long hours at jobs that paid little, always putting herself last. She had earned the right to dream, hadn't she? To want something better for herself. Before she could respond, Mr. Carter continued, "Tell me something. If you could change one thing about that dealership, what would it be?" Ruth blinked, caught off guard by the question. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Mr. Carter said patiently, "if you had the power to make things different there, if you were in charge, what would you do?" Ruth thought for a moment. "Well," she began hesitantly, "I'd stop them from treating people the way they treated me today. No one should feel small or unimportant, no matter how much money they have." Mr. Carter smiled. "Good answer. And what if I told you that you could make that happen?" Ruth stared at him, confused. "What are you talking about?" He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a thin folder. Handing it to her, he said, "This belongs to you now. Take a look." Curious despite herself, Ruth opened the folder. Inside were papers, legal documents, contracts, and bank statements. At first glance, they didn't make sense to her, but then she saw the name of the dealership printed clearly at the top of one page, Premier Motors. Her eyes widened. "What is this?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "It's ownership," Mr. Carter explained simply. "You're now the majority shareholder of Premier Motors. That means you own the place. Or rather, you will as soon as you sign these documents." Ruth nearly dropped the folder. Wait, what? How is this even possible? Why would you give me something like this?" Mr. Carter chuckled softly. "Let's just say I've been looking for someone like you for a long time. Someone who understands fairness, who knows what it's like to be treated unfairly, and who wants to make a difference. You're exactly the person this business needs." "But why me?" Ruth stammered. "I don't know anything about running a dealership." "You'll learn," Mr. Carter assured her. "And you won't be alone. There are people who can help you along the way. Besides, owning a business isn't just about knowing numbers or cars. It's about leading with integrity. Something tells me you're more than capable of that." Ruth felt overwhelmed. This was all happening so fast. One moment she was being thrown out of the dealership. The next she was being handed its keys. It felt surreal, like a dream, or maybe a trap. She narrowed her eyes at Mr. Carter. "Why are you doing this? What's in it for you?" Mr. Carter smiled again, this time with a hint of sadness. "Nothing, really. Let's just say I've lived long enough to know that some battles are worth fighting, even if you don't stand to gain anything from them. Watching you turn that dealership around, that's reward enough for me." Ruth studied him carefully. Despite her doubts, there was something genuine about him, something trustworthy. Slowly she nodded. "All right," she said quietly. "If you believe I can do this, then I'll try." "That's all I ask," Mr. Carter replied. He pointed to a pen tucked into the folder. "Sign here and it's official." With shaking hands, Ruth picked up the pen and signed her name on the dotted line. As soon as she finished, Mr. Carter took the folder back and slipped it into his coat. "Congratulations, Mrs. Jackson. You're the new owner of Premier Motors." Ruth exhaled deeply, still struggling to process everything. "What happens now?" "Now," Mr. Carter said, "you go back inside and show them exactly who they're dealing with. Trust me, they won't forget this day anytime soon." Gave her one last encouraging smile before turning and walking away. Ruth watched him disappear into the crowd, wondering if she'd ever see him again. But there was no time to dwell on that now. Taking a deep breath, she straightened her shoulders and marched back toward the dealership. Inside, the showroom buzzed with activity. Salespeople chatted with customers, phones rang, and the hum of conversation filled the air. No one noticed. Ruth at first as she walked through the door. When they did, however, the room fell silent. All eyes turned to her, including Greg's. Well, Greg sneered, stepping forward. "Back already? Did you forget something?" Ruth ignored him and scanned the room until she found Steve, the manager. He looked up from his desk, startled, to see her. "Can I help you?" he asked cautiously. "Yes," Ruth said firmly, her voice carrying across the room. You can gather your staff in the conference room. We need to talk. Steve frowned. We? Who's we? Ruth stepped closer, meeting his gaze without flinching. Me and the new owner of this dealership, which, as of 10 minutes ago, happens to be me. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence was deafening. Then Greg burst out laughing. You? The owner? That's ridiculous. It's true, Ruth shot back, pulling out a copy of the ownership papers Mr. Carter had given her. She held them up for everyone to see. Check for yourself if you don't believe me. Steve snatched the papers from her hand and skimmed through them. His face paled as he realized they were legitimate. This can't be right, he muttered. Oh, it's right, Ruth said, her confidence growing with each passing second. And starting today, things are going to change around here? Greg gaped at her, speechless for once in his life. The other employees exchanged nervous glances, unsure what to make of the situation. Ruth didn't wait for them to recover. She turned and headed toward the conference room, calling over her shoulder, "Everyone, now." As the staff reluctantly followed her, Ruth allowed herself a small smile. This wasn't going to be easy, she knew that. But for the first time in a long time, she felt powerful, respected, in control. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she was ready to face them head-on. Because now she wasn't just Ruth Jackson, the elderly woman dismissed and humiliated. She was Ruth Jackson, owner of Premier Motors, and she intended to prove that she belonged there more than anyone else. The conference room was small and cramped, with a long table in the center surrounded by mismatched chairs. The walls were bare except for a faded motivational poster that read, "Success is a journey, not a destination." Ruth stood at the head of the table, her hands resting firmly on its surface. She looked around at the faces staring back at her, some shocked, some confused, and others openly skeptical. Steve, the manager, sat closest to her, still holding the ownership papers in his hand as if they might disappear if he let go. Greg, the salesman who had humiliated her earlier, slouched in his chair, arms crossed tightly over his chest. His face was red. Whether from anger or embarrassment, it was hard to tell. The rest of the staff shifted uncomfortably in their seats, whispering among themselves. "All right," Ruth began, her voice steady despite the knot of nerves twisting in her stomach. "Let's get one thing straight right now. I am the new owner of Premier Motors. These papers prove it, and there's nothing any of you can do about it." Greg snorted loudly. "This has to be some kind of joke. How does someone like you just waltz in here and take over?" Ruth turned her gaze directly on him, her eyes sharp and unwavering. "Someone like me? You mean an honest person? Someone who believes in treating others with respect? If that's what you're talking about, then maybe this place needs more people like me." The room fell silent again. Ruth took a deep breath and continued. "Now, I didn't come here to argue or make enemies. I came here to fix things. This dealership has a reputation for being dishonest, pushy, and rude. That ends today. Starting now, we're going to run this business differently." Steve cleared his throat nervously. "Mrs. Jackson, I understand you're upset about what happened earlier, but running a dealership isn't easy. It takes experience, connections, and integrity," Ruth interrupted. "Something this place seems to have forgotten. From now on, every customer who walks through those doors will be treated fairly no matter how much money they have in their pockets. No lies, no tricks, no pressure tactics, just honesty and good service." A young woman sitting near the back raised her hand timidly. "What if customers don't like that? Some of them expect us to upsell them. They want fancy packages and add-ons." Ruth nodded thoughtfully. "I'm not saying we won't offer options, but those options need to be real choices, not traps. We'll give customers the information they need to make smart decisions. And if they choose something simple, that's fine too. Our job is to help, not manipulate." Greg rolled his eyes dramatically. "Yeah, because that's totally realistic. You think people are just going to trust us after everything?" "They will," Ruth said firmly. "Because we'll earn their trust. One customer at a time." She paused, letting her words sink in before moving on to the next topic. "Now, About staffing. I've seen how some of you treat customers like they're numbers instead of human beings. That stops now. Anyone who can't show basic respect doesn't belong here. Greg opened his mouth to protest, but Ruth cut him off before he could speak. And speaking of respect, she said, leveling her gaze at him, you're fired. Effective immediately. The room erupted into murmurs. Greg shot to his feet, his face turning an even deeper shade of red. You can't fire me. I've been here for years. You lost your job the moment you decided to humiliate me, Ruth replied coolly. Pack your things and leave. Don't let the door hit you on the way out. For a second, Greg looked like he might argue further, but then he seemed to realize everyone in the room was watching him. Muttering under his breath, he stormed out, slamming the door behind him. Once the noise died down, Ruth turned back to the group. Anyone else have a problem with how we're going to operate? No one spoke. The tension in the room was palpable, but Ruth could see glimmers of hope in some of their expressions. Maybe they didn't fully believe in her yet, but at least they weren't resisting outright. Good, she said. Now let's talk about changes. First, we're going to simplify our pricing. No hidden fees, no confusing jargon. Everything will be clear and upfront. Second, we're introducing training sessions for all employees. Not just salespeople, but mechanics, receptionists, everyone. We're going to learn how to communicate better, work together, and serve our customers with dignity. A man sitting near the middle of the table raised his hand hesitantly. That sounds great, Mrs. Jackson, but where's the money coming from? Training costs money, and so does advertising if we want to rebuild our reputation. Ruth smiled slightly. Don't worry about that. I've already spoken to the bank. There's plenty of funding available to cover these changes. Trust me, I've done my homework. The man nodded slowly, though he still looked uncertain. Ruth couldn't blame him. Change was scary, especially when it came so suddenly. But she was determined to make it work. Over the next few weeks, Ruth threw herself into transforming the dealership. She spent hours reviewing financial records, meeting with employees and brainstorm customers' experiences. It wasn't easy. There were days when she felt overwhelmed, when the weight of responsibility threatened to crush her. But she refused to give up. One of the first people she connected with was Marcus, a young mechanic who worked in the garage. He was quiet and reserved, often overlooked by the other employees, but Ruth saw potential in him. When she asked for his input on improving operations, he surprised her with insightful suggestions. We should focus on quality over speed, Marcus told her during one of their conversations. Customers care more about knowing their car is safe than getting it back quickly. If we take the extra time to double-check repairs, they'll notice and they'll come back. Ruth loved the idea and implemented it immediately. Under her leadership, the mechanics began prioritizing thoroughness over efficiency, and the results spoke for themselves. Repairs were completed correctly the first time, reducing complaints and building trust with customers. Meanwhile, Ruth also made efforts to connect with the community. She organized free car maintenance workshops for local residents, hosted charity drives to collect supplies for families in need, and partnered with schools to provide internships for students interested in automotive careers. Slowly but surely, the dealership's reputation began to improve. Of course, not everyone was happy about the changes. Some longtime employees grumbled about the stricter policies and increased workload. A few even quit, claiming they couldn't adapt to Ruth's new vision. But those who stayed found themselves growing alongside the business. They learned to value teamwork, honesty, and accountability, all qualities Ruth insisted on fostering. Months passed. The impact of Ruth's leadership became undeniable. Sales started to rise not because of flashy promotions or aggressive tactics, but because customers appreciated the transparency and care they received. Word spread quickly, and soon Premier Motors was known as one of the most trustworthy dealerships in the area. Through it all, Ruth remained humble. She never forgot why she had taken on this challenge in the first place, to stand up against injustice and create something meaningful. Every success, no matter how small, reminded her that she was capable of far more than anyone, including herself, had ever imagined. And yet, as proud as she was of what she had accomplished, Ruth knew there was still work to be done. The dealership was thriving, yes, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was hiding beneath the surface. Something darker. Little did she know, uncovering the truth would test her resolve in ways she couldn't yet imagine. As the months went by, Ruth settled into her role as the owner of Premier Motors. The dealership was thriving under her leadership, and the community had embraced its new direction. Customers praised the honesty and fairness they experienced, and employees who adapted to Ruth's values found a renewed sense of purpose in their work. But beneath the surface of success, Ruth began noticing odd things, small details that didn't quite add up. It started with paperwork. Ruth spent hours reviewing old records from before she took over, trying to understand how the business had been run. At first, everything seemed normal. Sales reports, inventory lists, and employee schedules lined up neatly. But then she stumbled upon something strange, a series of transactions labeled miscellaneous expenses. These entries were vague, with no explanation or receipts attached. When she asked Steve, the manager, about them, he shrugged it off. "Oh, those are just miscellaneous costs," Steve said casually. "You know, office supplies, cleaning services, stuff like that." Ruth frowned. "Office supplies don't cost thousands of dollars at a time." Steve hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "Well, I'm sure there's an explanation somewhere. Maybe we should check with accounting." But when Ruth dug deeper, she discovered more inconsistencies. Some invoices referenced parts or services that didn't match any actual repairs performed at the dealership. Other documents hinted at payments made to third-party companies she'd never heard of. The deeper she looked, the more suspicious it all became. One evening, after most of the staff had gone home, Ruth stayed late in her office. She spread out the questionable papers across her desk, trying to piece together what was going on. Marcus, the young mechanic, knocked lightly on the doorframe and stepped inside. "You're still here?" he asked, surprised. "It's getting late." "I know," Ruth replied, not looking up. "I can't stop thinking about these files." "Something isn't right, Marcus. There's too much missing information, too many unanswered questions." Marcus pulled up a chair and sat down beside her. "What kind of questions?" She handed him one of the invoices. "Take a look at this. It says we bought brake pads from a company called Apex Auto Supplies. But I've never seen that name before, and none of our mechanics remember ordering anything from them." Marcus examined the document closely. "That's weird. We usually order parts directly from manufacturers or trusted distributors. Why would we go through someone else?" "Exactly," Ruth said. "And it gets worse. Look at these dates. They line up with some of our biggest sales months. Almost like someone was siphoning money during peak times when no one would notice." Marcus frowned. "Do you think it's fraud?" "I don't know yet," Ruth admitted, "but I intend to find out." The next day, Ruth decided to dig even deeper. She called the parent company that owned Premier Motors, a large corporation based out of Chicago, and requested detailed financial records for the past 5 years. To her surprise, the request was denied almost immediately. A representative, named Mr. Dawson, informed her that such information was confidential and could only be accessed by senior executives. "This is my dealership," Ruth argued over the phone. "I have a right to know where the money is going." "I'm sorry, Mrs. Jackson," Mr. Dawson replied stiffly. "Company policy dictates otherwise. If you have concerns, please direct them to your regional manager." Frustrated but undeterred, Ruth turned to Marcus for help. Together, they devised a plan to investigate further. They began reaching out to former employees, asking discreetly if anyone had noticed anything unusual during their time at the dealership. Most people either refused to talk or claimed ignorance, but a few shared valuable insights. One ex-salesman, a middle-aged man named Carl, agreed to meet Ruth at a nearby cafe. Over coffee, he revealed troubling details. "There was always pressure to hit quotas," he explained. "If we didn't sell enough high-margin packages, we'd get written up or worse, fired. And sometimes management would encourage us to push unnecessary upgrades onto customers, even if it meant lying about what they needed." Ruth listened intently, her jaw tightening. "Did anyone ever question it?" Carl shook his head. Not really. If you spoke up, you'd find yourself out of a job real quick. Plus, there were rumors about kickbacks, executives getting bonuses for inflating prices or cutting shady deals behind closed doors. Though grateful for Carl's honesty, Ruth left the cafe feeling uneasy. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but the bigger picture remained unclear. Whoever was behind these schemes had gone to great lengths to cover their tracks. Her suspicions deepened when she received an anonymous letter in the mail. Written in blocky handwriting on plain white paper, it read, "Stop asking questions. You won't like what you find." Ruth stared at the note, her heart pounding. Was this a warning? A threat? She wasn't sure, but she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't back down now. Whatever secrets lurked within Premier Motors, she was determined to uncover them. With Marcus's help, Ruth compiled all the evidence they had gathered so far. Questionable invoices, testimonies from former employees, and notes about discrepancies in the financial records. They decided to take their findings to a local journalist named Linda Harper, who specialized in exposing corporate corruption. Linda met them at her office, a small room cluttered with stacks of newspapers and half-empty coffee cups. After hearing Ruth's story, she nodded thoughtfully. "This sounds serious," she said. "If what you're saying is true, it could implicate top-level executives. Are you ready for the fallout?" Ruth took a deep breath. "I didn't ask for this fight, but I'm not walking away from it. People deserve to know the truth." Over the next several weeks, Linda worked tirelessly to verify Ruth's claims. She contacted sources within the industry, cross-referenced data, and pieced together a damning narrative of greed and deception. Meanwhile, Ruth continued running the dealership, keeping her investigation secret from everyone except Marcus. Finally, the day came when Linda's article was published. It appeared on the front page of the city's largest newspaper, accompanied by bold headlines: Premier Motors Scandal Exposed, Kickbacks, Fraud, and Corporate Corruption. The article detailed years of unethical practices orchestrated by high-ranking executives at the parent company. It revealed how inflated prices, fake invoices, and illegal kickbacks had drained millions of dollars from dealerships like Ruth's, leaving them struggling while executives lined their pockets. The public reaction was immediate and explosive. Customers demanded answers, shareholders called emergency meetings, and government agencies launched investigations. Within days, several top executives resigned amid mounting pressure. The parent company issued a formal apology, promising sweeping reforms, but the damage was done. At Premier Motors, Ruth watched the chaos unfold with a mix of satisfaction and sadness. She had hoped her efforts would bring justice, but seeing the extent of the corruption left her shaken. Still, she refused to let bitterness consume her. Instead, she focused on rebuilding, not just the dealership but trust itself. When the dust settled, the parent company was forced to sell off assets to recover from the scandal, including Premier Motors. Ruth seized the opportunity to buy full ownership outright, ensuring the business remained independent and free from corporate interference. Under her leadership, it became a model of ethical business practices, earning praise from customers and competitors alike. Looking back, Ruth realized how much she had grown since that humiliating day when she was thrown out of the showroom. She had faced fear, doubt, and danger, but she had emerged stronger than ever. More importantly, she had proven that integrity could triumph over greed, and that sometimes the smallest voices carried the loudest truths. Years had passed since Ruth Jackson took over Premier Motors and exposed the corruption that had plagued it. The dealership was now a cornerstone of the community, known not just for selling cars but for its values: honesty, fairness, and compassion. Customers came from miles around, not only to buy vehicles but to meet the woman who had turned an ugly scandal into a story of hope. People called her the Heart of Atlanta, though Ruth would laugh off such praise, insisting she was just doing what anyone else would have done. Inside the showroom, the atmosphere buzzed with energy. The staff worked together seamlessly, their camaraderie a testament to Ruth's leadership. Marcus, once a quiet mechanic in the shadows, had risen to become the head of operations. He was Ruth's right hand, helping her navigate both the technical and human sides of running the business. Together, they had built something special, a place where employees felt valued and customers felt respected. On this particular morning, Ruth sat in her modest office, sipping coffee as she reviewed monthly reports. Her desk was cluttered with papers, photos, and mementos from the journey she'd been on. One framed picture caught her eye, a group photo of the staff taken during last year's holiday party. Everyone was smiling, arms slung over shoulders, looking like a family. Ruth smiled softly at the memory. She hadn't set out to create a family when she first walked into the dealership all those years ago, but somehow, that's exactly what she had done. As she flipped through the pages of the report, a knock sounded at the door. Without waiting for an answer, Greg stepped inside. It was the same Greg who had humiliated her on her very first visit to the dealership, the same man she had fired without hesitation. Ruth froze, staring at him in disbelief. "Greg," she said finally, setting down her pen. "What are you doing here?" He shuffled awkwardly, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. I wanted to talk to you." Ruth gestured for him to sit, though her expression remained guarded. "All right, talk." Greg hesitated before lowering himself into the chair across from her. "I know I don't deserve your time after everything I did, but I heard about how much this place has changed since I left, how good it's become. And—" He swallowed hard, avoiding her gaze. "And I wanted to say, I'm sorry for treating you the way I did, for being part of the problem instead of the solution." For a long moment, Ruth said nothing. She studied him carefully, searching for sincerity in his face. Finally, she spoke. "Apologies are easy, Greg. Anyone can say they're sorry. What matters is whether you mean it, and whether you've learned anything." "I do mean it," he replied quickly. "And yes, I've learned. Losing my job here was humbling. It made me realize how wrong I was, not just about you, but about how I treated people in general. I've spent the last few years working odd jobs, trying to figure out who I am and what kind of person I want to be. And I hope, I'm better than I used to be." Ruth leaned back in her chair, considering his words. She didn't trust him completely, not yet, but she saw something in his eyes, a flicker of regret, maybe even redemption. After a pause, she nodded slowly. "Okay, Greg, you get one chance. If you mess this up, there won't be another." Relief washed over his face. "Thank you, Mrs. Jackson. You won't regret it." Over the following weeks, Greg proved himself little by little. He started at the bottom, cleaning floors and organizing inventory, tasks far below his previous role as a senior salesman, but he didn't complain. Instead, he worked hard, showing genuine effort to change. His colleagues were skeptical at first, but over time, they began to see glimpses of the man he was becoming. Ruth watched closely, proud of how far he'd come, and the years rolled on. Ruth grew older. Running the dealership required less of her day-to-day involvement now, thanks to Marcus and the capable team she had built. Still, she remained a fixture at the dealership, often seen chatting with customers or offering advice to new hires. Her presence alone seemed to inspire those around her. One sunny afternoon, Ruth stood outside the showroom, gazing at the rows of gleaming cars. A young mother approached her, holding the hand of a toddler. "Excuse me, ma'am," the woman said shyly. "Are you Ruth Jackson?" "Yes, I am," Ruth replied warmly. "How can I help you?" The woman smiled. "I just wanted to thank you. I bought my first car here last year. Before that, I thought dealerships were all the same, pushy and dishonest. But coming here changed my mind. You've created something really special." Ruth's eyes softened. "That means more to me than you know. Thank you for sharing that." After the woman left, Ruth lingered outside a little longer, lost in thought. She thought about how far she'd come, from a woman dismissed and humiliated to someone others looked up to. She thought about the challenges she'd faced, the battles she'd fought, and the victories she'd earned. Most of all, she thought about the legacy she was leaving behind. That evening, Ruth gathered her closest team members, Marcus, Steve, who had stayed loyal throughout, and a few others, in the conference room. They noticed immediately that something was different about her demeanor. Gone was the usual spark of determination. Instead, there was a quiet resolve. "I've been thinking," Ruth began, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "It's time for me to step back. I'm not as young as I used to be, and this business needs fresh energy, fresh ideas. So, I've decided to retire." The room erupted into protests. "No, Mrs. Jackson," Marcus exclaimed. "We need you here." Ruth held up a hand to silence them. "You don't need me anymore. You've grown into leaders, each of you. This dealership doesn't belong to me, it belongs to all of you, to the community we serve. My job is done." There were tears in some of their eyes, but Ruth smiled reassuringly. "Don't worry. I'll still be around if you need advice, but it's your turn now. Take care of this place and keep doing the work we started." In the weeks that followed, Ruth handed over the reins to Marcus, officially naming him the new owner of Premier Motors. Though she attended the transition ceremony with pride, she couldn't help feeling a pang of sadness as she locked her office, for the final time. But as she walked out of the building, she reminded herself that endings were also beginnings. Ruth spent her retirement volunteering at local charities, mentoring young entrepreneurs, and spending time with her grandchildren. She often drove past the dealership, smiling whenever she saw its glowing sign. It was thriving under Marcus's leadership, just as she had hoped. One evening, as Ruth sat on her porch watching the sunset, she reflected on her life. She had faced humiliation, betrayal, and fear. But she had also found courage, friendship, and purpose. She had taken something broken and made it whole again, not just the dealership but herself. And in doing so, she had shown the world that kindness and integrity could overcome even the greatest odds. As the sky darkened and stars began to twinkle above, Ruth closed her eyes and let out a contented sigh. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain. She had lived a life worth living, and that was enough.